Hey friends, welcome back, or if you're new here, welcome to Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files. I'm your host, Kate. Grab your favorite choice of caffeine, get comfy, and sip slowly with this story. Just a quick listener discretion. This episode includes violence against the elderly. Please take care of yourself while listening. If you need to skip this one, that is okay. You can always come back to it later. Okay, so this is a voiceover from a lady by the name of Sandy Millard. Quote, "It kills me to know that she cried when she was attacked. She fought the predator and cried out for over an hour, and no one answered her. For over an hour, she cried out, in the middle of the night, in a place that was supposed to be safe. A place her family chose with love and trust. Gladys Millard fought for her life. She was 87 years old. She was a seamstress, she was a mother, and she did not want to die. But no one came, not because they were negligent in the usual sense, not because they were lazy or overworked, though they certainly were. No one came because the person holding the syringe, the person injecting a lethal dose of insulin into Gladys Millard's frail body, was the one person everyone was trained to trust. She was the nurse. Her name was Elizabeth Wettlaufer. And this is her story. Before we begin, I want you to understand why this case is different from every other true crime story you've heard. When we think of serial killers, we think of strangers in alleyways. We think of men in vans offering candy. We think of dark figures who lurk on the edges of society. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was none of those things. She was a middle-aged woman from rural Ontario. She went to church on Sundays. She worked the night shift at the local nursing home. She was, by every external measure, boring. And that is precisely what made her so dangerous. Between 2007 and 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer murdered at least 8 people and attempted to kill 6 others. Every single one of her victims was vulnerable. Every single one was elderly. Every single one was in her care. And every single one died or suffered under the assumption that they were simply old, that their deaths were expected, that their lives were not worth investigating. The most terrifying part of this story is not what Wettlaufer did, it's that the system designed to protect these people, employers, regulators, police, coroners, failed so completely that she was only caught because she walked into a psychiatric hospital and confessed. If Elizabeth Wettlaufer had kept her mouth shut, she would be free today, and we would never know her name. To understand Elizabeth Wettlaufer, we have to go back to the beginning. She was born Elizabeth May Parker in 1967 in the small rural community of Zora Township near Woodstock, Ontario. This is farming country, flat, open, quiet. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the community means something, where doors are left unlocked. The Parker family were devout Baptists. Church wasn't just a Sunday obligation, it was the center of their social world, their moral compass, their identity. Young Elizabeth grew up with hymns instead of pop songs, with potlucks instead of parties, with a God who saw everything she did. Those who remember her from those early years describe a normal girl. Quiet, perhaps, a bit shy, but not the kind of child who made anyone nervous. She was the girl in the pew, the neighbor's daughter, the face you'd see at the grocery store. But there was something else beneath the surface. Later, much later, investigators would piece together a childhood marked by what they called significant family dysfunction. The details remain private, sealed by court order, or buried in psychological reports. But the outlines suggest a home life that was more complicated than the church pews suggested. After high school, Elizabeth faced a choice that would define her adult life. She had 2 passions, and they pulled her in very different directions. First, there was faith. She enrolled at London Baptist Bible College, where she earned a bachelor's degree in religious education counseling. The goal, presumably, was to help people, to guide them through their darkest moments with scripture and compassion. She graduated, But she never became a pastor. She never worked as a counselor. That degree would sit on her shelf, gathering dust, until it became useful for something else entirely. Second, there was science. She enrolled at Conestoga College in Kitchener and studied nursing. In 1995, at the age of 28, she became a registered nurse. Think about that combination for a moment. A woman trained in both religious counseling and medical care. A woman who understood the soul and the body. On paper, she was the perfect caregiver, someone who could tend to the whole person, who could sit with the dying and ease their passage. But there was a darkness in her that neither her faith nor her training could cure, and it emerged almost immediately. Just 1 year into her nursing career, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was fired from her first job at a hospital in London, Ontario. The reason? Theft. She had been caught stealing the anti-anxiety medication, lorazepam pills, that belonged to patients, pills that were meant to ease suffering, not to feed a nurse's addiction. But it wasn't just theft. According to documents later uncovered by the public inquiry, Wettlaufer showed up to work high on the very drugs she had stolen. She was impaired while caring for patients. She was a danger to everyone in her orbit. And then there was the suicide attempt. Wettlaufer later admitted that she had tried to kill herself using the stolen medication. Whether this was a genuine cry for help or a manipulation tactic, we may never know. What we do know is that the hospital did what they were supposed to do. They fired her, and they reported the incident to the College of Nurses of Ontario. This was their first chance to stop her. The college received the report. They filed it, and then nothing. No investigation, no follow-up, no revocation of her license. The report sat in a filing cabinet, invisible to future employers, invisible to anyone who might have wondered why this nurse had such a short first job. The College of Nurses would later claim that they couldn't take action without more evidence. But the evidence was right there: a termination for drug theft, an admission of impairment, a suicide attempt. They had everything they needed. They chose to do nothing. In 1997, Elizabeth married Donnie Wettlaufer, a local man who worked in construction. For a time, they seemed like any other young couple in rural Ontario, working, saving, building a life. But the marriage was troubled from the start. By 2007, it was over. The divorce was finalized, and Elizabeth Wettlaufer found herself alone, angry, and adrift. She later told police that during this period, she was just angry in general at my job, at my life. That anger would find a target. In 2007, the same year her marriage ended, Wettlaufer walked through the doors of the Caress and Care long-term home in Woodstock, Ontario. She was looking for work. They were looking for nurses. They saw her license, her experience, her calm demeanor. They did not see the 1995 termination because no one had thought to look for it. They did not see the addiction because no one had thought to ask. They hired her, and the killing began. Before we go any further, we need to stop. We need to stop and truly see the people whose lives were taken, not as names on a charge sheet, not as statistics in a true crime podcast, but as human beings with faces, with families, with stories that began long before Elizabeth Wettlaufer entered their rooms. This section is long, it is detailed, it is meant to be, because these people deserve to be remembered, and because the only way to understand the full horror of what Wettlaufer did is to understand who she did it to. James Silcox was 84 years old when he died. But to understand his death, you have to understand his life. James was born in 1923 in a world still recovering from the First World War. He grew up during the Great Depression, learning to make do with less, learning to fix what was broken rather than throw it away. That skill, fixing things, would define his life. When the Second World War broke out, James was just 17 years old. He lied about his age to enlist. He wanted to serve his country. to fight against the fascism spreading across Europe. He joined the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, and for more than 4 years, he was in the thick of it. He served in Sicily, where Allied forces fought their way up the Italian boot. He served on the Italian mainland through some of the toughest fighting of the war. He served in France after D-Day, as the Allies pushed toward Germany. He served in Belgium and the Netherlands, and he was actually there, when the Dutch people were finally liberated from the Nazi occupation. His family says he never talked much about the war. Like so many veterans of that generation, he kept it inside. But he was proud of one thing. He had been in Holland when it was freed. That moment, seeing people emerge from hiding, seeing them wave Canadian flags, that stayed with him. After the war, James came home and married Agnes Bond. They stayed married for more than 60 years. They raised 6 children together. James found work at the Standard Tube Factory in Woodstock, eventually becoming a foreman. He was the kind of man who could fix anything: a broken toaster, a leaky faucet, a child's bicycle. He was a prankster, known for his dry wit and his ability to make people laugh. He loved animals, and animals loved him back. His family's victim impact statement described him as a gentleman, a helpmate, a problem solver, a fixer, a builder, a prankster, an animal lover, a true card, a compassionate and loving human being, and a man of deep, abiding faith. In his later years, James developed Alzheimer's disease. He also had diabetes and had undergone hip replacement surgery. His family made the difficult decision to place him at Crescent Care, where he would receive round-the-clock care. They visited often. They trusted the staff. On August 11, 2007, Elizabeth Wettlaufer entered his room and injected him with a massive, unnecessary dose of insulin. His blood sugar plummeted. He died. Here's what Wettlaufer later told police about that moment. After killing James Silcox, she felt like a pressure lifted from my emotions. But when his family thanked her for her care, she felt remorse, but not enough to stop. His daughter Andrea later said that her father would want her to forgive Wettlaufer. He was that kind of man, forgiving, gentle. But she added, "I'll never forget my dad. I'll never forget what happened. I'll never forget these horrible days." His son David wrote, "I simply feel guilty for not being able to protect my father as he had protected me." And as his granddaughter Jane revealed something heartbreaking, "The murder has torn us apart, turned siblings against each other, broken up our family. The grief was so profound, so disorienting, that it fractured the very bonds James Silcox had spent a lifetime building." James's wife, Agnes, learned the truth about her husband's death years later. She was in her own declining health by then. The family believes the shock and grief contributed to her death just 3 weeks after learning the news. In a very real sense, Wettlaufer killed her too. Maurice Mo Gredat was known to everyone as Mo. He was 84 years old, a retired mechanic, a father of 2. His friend Laura Jackson described him as a much-needed father figure in her life. Mo was the kind of person who showed up when you needed him. He didn't make grand gestures. He just was there. A phone call to check in, ride to an appointment, a steady presence in a chaotic world. After Mo's death, Laura Jackson fell into a deep depression. It wasn't just sadness, it was a physical sickness that left her unable to function. She lost her job. She lost her sense of self. In her victim impact statement, she wrote, quote, "There will always be an empty place that Mo's loss has caused." Laura later sat in the courtroom and looked at Elizabeth Wettlaufer. She described her as someone you couldn't pick out of a crowd, and that, she realized, was the most frightening thing of all. She blends in. And the frightening thing is, when you look at her, you don't think monster. And that's what she is. She's a monster. She's just a regular, normal person who did these horrible, horrific things. That ordinariness, that ability to disappear into the background was Wettlaufer's superpower. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like your neighbor, your colleague, your nurse. And because she looked like that, no one suspected. Before she killed James Silcox, Wettlaufer practiced. Her first known attacks were on two sisters, Clotilde Adriano, 87, and Albina de Medeiros, 88. The sisters were close. They had spent their lives together, and now, in their final years, they found themselves in the same nursing home. They could visit each other's rooms, share meals, comfort each other in the long, quiet hours of old age. Sometime between June and December 2007, Wettlaufer injected both sisters with insulin. Both survived the immediate assault. Clotilda died a year later, Albina in 2010. Their deaths were attributed to natural causes, but Wettlaufer confessed. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of aggravated assault for their suffering. We don't know what those hours after the injections were like for Clotilda and Albina. The confusion, the pain, the fear. We only know that they endured them and that no one ever knew why. Gladys Millard was 87 years old. She was a seamstress by trade, a woman who could look at a piece of fabric and see what it could become. She was also, by all accounts, a fighter. Her daughter Sandy later described her as a woman with a fierce will to live. That will was on full display in the early morning of October 14, 2011. Wettlaufer entered Gladys's room and injected her with a massive overdose of insulin. But Gladys didn't go quietly. She didn't slip peacefully into unconsciousness. She fought. For over an hour, Gladys Millard cried out. She struggled. She tried to get help. She made noise, loud, desperate noise, that should have brought staff running to her room. No one came. Sandy later told the court, "It kills me to know that she cried when she was attacked. She fought the predator and cried out for over an hour, and no one answered her." Think about that. An hour. 60 minutes of fear, of pain, of fighting for your life, and no one comes. Not because they didn't care, but because the person who should have been helping was the person causing the harm, and everyone else was too far away, or too distracted, or too accustomed to the sounds of elderly distress to investigate. Sandy continued, quote, "Finding out she was killed by a huge injection of medication she did not need broke my heart. I hardly sleep at night and feel exhausted." Gladys Millard's death wasn't just a murder. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental trust. The trust that when you're vulnerable, when you're old and sick and scared, someone will come when you call. No one came for Gladys, and that knowledge will haunt your daughter forever. Helen Matheson was 95 years old. She was just 11 days shy of her 96th birthday when she was killed. Her son John described her as sweet, kind, and gentle-spirited. She was the kind of mother who made a house a home, who raised her children with love and patience, who deserved to end her days in peace. When John learned that his mother had been murdered, not died naturally, but murdered, something inside him broke. Since her death, he has been hospitalized 6 times due to stress and depression. 6 times. The grief was so overwhelming that his body literally gave out. In his victim impact statement, John wrote, quote, "Peace of mind is not something I enjoy any longer." His son Colin wrote something even more haunting, quote, "Why didn't I save her?" That question, "Why didn't I save her?" echoes through every family statement. The guilt, the second guessing, the endless loop of what if. They trusted the system. They placed their loved ones in professional care, and that trust was weaponized against them. Mary Zerowinski was 96 years old. She was young at heart, the kind of elderly woman who still enjoyed looking her best. Complete with lipstick, jewelry, and nail polish, she took pride in her appearance, in presenting herself to the world with dignity. Her family noted something important. Mary was adamant she would live to be 100. She had plans. She had goals. She had years left that she intended to enjoy. Wettlaufer stole those years. Mary was killed just weeks after Gladys Millard and Helen Matheson in a spree of violence that seemed to have no pattern, no logic, no trigger. Her family's joint statement read, "We, the entire family, have all suffered emotionally, mentally, socially, and physically as a result of this crime." The suffering wasn't just about the loss, it was about the violation. Their mother, their grandmother, had been killed by the very person entrusted with her care. The world had been turned upside down, and nothing would ever feel safe again. Helen Young was 90 years old when she died, but her death was different from others. It was more violent, more desperate. Wettlaufer didn't give Helen one injection. She gave her multiple injections of insulin. Helen's body reacted with seizures, violent, terrifying seizures that shook her frail frame. She suffered before she died. After killing Helen Young, Wettlaufer was plagued with guilt. Not enough to stop killing, she would kill again, but enough to seek help. She turned to her pastor. She sat at his kitchen table and confessed everything. The murders, the attempts, the overwhelming compulsion. She told him she couldn't stop. The pastor listened. He prayed for her, and then he delivered an ultimatum, quote, "If you ever do this again, we will have to turn you into the police." Notice what he didn't do. He didn't call the police immediately. He didn't report her to the College of Nurses. He gave her a warning and sent her back out into the world. Months later, she killed again. This raises uncomfortable questions. At what point does a confidential conversation become a duty to report? At what point does the seal of the confessional become complicity in murder? The pastor clearly struggled with this. He later told investigators he didn't fully believe her, that he thought she might be having some kind of breakdown, but he had enough belief to issue a warning. He just didn't have enough to act. Helen Young's niece, Sharon, later shared a moment that haunts her. After her aunt's death, she had hugged Wettlaufer and thanked her for her care. She didn't know she was hugging the murderer. That moment, she said, haunts her. Imagine living with that. Imagine knowing that you embraced the person who killed your aunt, that you expressed gratitude to the woman who made her seize and suffer and die. Sharon will carry that for the rest of her life. Maureen Pickering was 79 years old. She was described by her friends, Deanna and Donald Tuck, as a very intelligent and an elegant lady. When Maureen began struggling with Alzheimer's disease, the Tucks faced a difficult decision. They couldn't care for her around the clock themselves, so they began searching for a good care home. They chose Crescent Care because it seemed reputable, because the staff seemed kind, because it was the kind of place where you'd want your own mother to live. After Maureen's sudden death, the Tucks were suspicious. Maureen, despite her Alzheimer's, was physically healthy. Her death from a blood sugar crash didn't make sense. They requested an autopsy. The coroner refused. The reason? No death in a nursing home is unexpected. Let that sink in. Because Maureen Pickering was old, because she lived in a nursing home, her death was deemed not worth investigating. The coroner didn't know about Wettlaufer. He didn't know about the other deaths. He just knew that old people die, and he saw no reason to look deeper. That mindset, that bias against the elderly, gave Elizabeth Wettlaufer her power. She could kill openly, in plain sight, because no one would ever question it. Old people die. That's what they do. In their victim impact statement, the Tucks wrote, quote, "We feel terrible guilt. We put our friend in a place where her life was taken. We should not be living our final days filled with guilt." The murder of Maureen Pickering happened just days before Wettlaufer was finally fired from Crescent Care. But she wasn't fired for killing Maureen. She was fired for giving the wrong medication to the wrong patient, a routine medication error that had nothing to do with murder. The killings had been happening for 7 years, and the only reason she lost her job was a paperwork mistake. Arpad Horvath's life was the definition of the Canadian dream, and his death was the definition of tragedy. Arpad was born in Hungary in 1939. When he was just 18 years old, the Soviet Union crushed the Hungarian Revolution, sending tanks into Budapest and hunting down anyone who had dared to hope for freedom. Arpad knew he had to get out. He bribed border guards with cigarettes and chewing gum, the only currency he had, and crossed into Austria. From there, he made his way to Canada. He and his brother eventually settled in Ontario because they had an uncle in Leamington. They arrived with nothing but clothes on their backs and the dirt and the determination to build something new. And build he did. Arpad became the successful owner of a tool and die company in London, Ontario. He didn't just employ people, he employed immigrants, people like he had been, giving them the same foothold he had received. He owned 2 farms on the outskirts of London, one with excavated ponds and a menagerie of birds and animals, deer scampering through the trees, peacocks strutting, guinea hens filling the air with their distinctive calls. He loved hunting, a pursuit that took him across the world. He served as a longtime president of London's Hungarian Club, keeping his culture alive in his new homeland. He was fiercely proud of Canada. His daughter-in-law Audrey said, quote, "If anyone said anything bad about Canada, he'd say, 'This is a place that gave me a home.'" When his health declined due to strokes and dementia, his family placed him at Meadow Park Long-Term Care Home in London. They visited often. They trusted the staff. On August 31st, 2014, Wettlaufer entered his room and injected him with insulin. But Arpad fought, even in his weakened state, even with dementia clouding his mind. He resisted. He struggled against the injection. He tried to push her away. His daughter Susan later said with pride, "He's a fighter. Even until the end, he fought. He was strong. All the time, regardless of what health issues he had, he was strong. That strength has helped Susan cope," she said. Quote, "And I'm very happy that I resemble him a lot in the family, because that's what's been pulling me through all of this." In court, Susan was direct about Wettlaufer's apology. No forgiveness for her whatsoever. Not a chance. "No, I'm sorry. I'm too tough-hearted for that. I'm not going to forgive her for nothing. She knew what she was doing." Her brother Arpad Jr. was even more blunt. He dismissed Wettlaufer's apology as a waste of time, paper, and air. He said, quote, "She took away my best friend and my hero. I can't forgive that." Arpad Horvath escaped communist tanks, built a life from nothing, gave his jobs to strangers, and loved his adopted country with every fiber of his being. And he was killed by a nurse in a nursing home, a place that should have been safe. Before we leave the victims, we need to talk about the ones who lived, the ones who survived Wettlaufer's injections and have to. Michael Priddle, 63. In 2008, at Crescent Care, Wettlaufer injected Michael with insulin. He survived. She pleaded guilty to attempted murder in his case. Wayne Hedges, 57, also in 2008, also at Crescent Care. Wettlaufer injected Wayne. He survived. Another count of attempted murder. Sandra Towler, 77. In 2015, at the Telfer Place Retirement Home in Paris, Ontario, Wettlaufer injected Sandra with insulin. She survived. Wettlaufer was let go from that job quietly. No report, no police, no nothing. Beverly Bertram, 68. This is Wettlaufer's last known attack. In 2016, at a private residence in Ingersoll, Ontario, Wettlaufer injected Beverly with insulin. Beverly survived. In her victim impact statement, Beverly said something that captures the ongoing terror of being a survivor. Quote, "I was worried she would get out and come to finish the job. I'm afraid of my own shadow." Think about that. Afraid of your own shadow. Because the person who tried to kill you is still out there, still a threat, still capable of finishing what she started. Beverly Bertram will never feel safe again, and that is its own kind of murder. So what drove Elizabeth Wettlaufer to kill? This is the question everyone wants answered, and the answer is frustratingly incomplete. In her videotaped confession to police, Wettlaufer described a sensation she called, quote, "the red surge," end quote. It would start in her stomach, she said, and rise up through her chest. When it came, she felt that, quote, "God or the devil or whatever wanted me to do it," end quote. After one murder, she recalled feeling a cackling from the pit of hell inside her chest. The feeling after a killing was euphoria. This is the language of compulsion, of addiction. Wettlaufer didn't describe the killings as choices. She described them as urges, as forces that overtook her. But here's the complication. She also described planning. She would check patients' charts, identify who was diabetic, figure out who had insulin orders. She would wait for the right moment, night shifts, when staffing was low, when no one was watching. That's not compulsion. That's calculation. Wettlaufer's legal team initially floated the idea of a defense based on her religious upbringing. The argument, as presented in pretrial motions, was that Wettlaufer believed herself to be a vessel of God, and that her actions were therefore not fully her own. This defense never made it to trial. Wettlaufer pleaded guilty before it could be tested. But the very fact that it was considered tells us something about how she saw herself. She wasn't just a killer, she was an instrument of something larger, something divine or demonic, something beyond her control. Psychological evaluations conducted after her arrest painted a more complicated picture. Doctors diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, a condition marked by unstable relationships, intense emotions, and a fragile sense of self. They also noted traits of narcissism, a need for admiration, a lack of empathy, a sense of specialness. But none of these diagnoses explained why she killed. Millions of people have borderline personality disorder and never hurt anyone. Millions of people have difficult childhoods and troubled marriages and substance abuse problems and never inject insulin into elderly patients. The diagnoses describe her. They don't excuse her. There's another layer to this. Wettlaufer was an addict. She had been stealing drugs since 1995. She had attempted suicide with stolen medication. She was in and out of rehab throughout her nursing career. Some experts have suggested that the killings may have been connected to her addiction, not in the sense that she was high when she killed, but in the sense that the act of killing provided the same kind of rush as drugs, the euphoria. She described sounds like the language of addiction, the craving, the release, the crash, the need for more. But again, this doesn't explain why she started. Most addicts don't become serial killers. Most people who feel angry and trapped don't start injecting insulin into the elderly. There's a missing piece here, something in Wettlaufer's psychology that we may never fully understand. Perhaps the most frightening thing about Wettlaufer is how ordinary she seemed. Colleagues described her as quiet, a bit odd, prone to mood swings, but not someone you'd suspect of murder. Families thanked her for her care. Patients trusted her with their lives. This is what criminologists call the mask of sanity, the ability of certain psychopathic individuals to appear completely normal while hiding a complete absence of empathy. Wettlaufer could cry with a grieving family in the morning and plan her next murder in the afternoon. She could feel remorse after killing James Silcox and then kill again 7 times. The mask was so effective that even when she confessed, people didn't believe her. Her Narcotics Anonymous sponsor thought she was lying. Her ex-boyfriend thought she was having a psychiatric episode. Her pastor thought she was confused. She was telling the truth, and no one could accept it because she looked too normal to be a monster. We've spent a lot of time on Wettlaufer herself, but the truth is she couldn't have killed 8 people and attacked 6 others without help. Not active help. She didn't have accomplices, but passive help, systemic help, the help of institutions that looked the other way. The College of Nurses of Ontario is a regulatory body responsible for licensing and disciplining nurses in the province. Their job is to protect the public by ensuring that only competent, ethical nurses are allowed to practice. In 1995, they received a report that Elizabeth Wettlaufer had been fired for stealing drugs and working impaired, yet they did nothing. In 2014, they received another report that Wettlaufer had been fired from Crescent Care for medication errors. They did nothing. Why? According to the public inquiry, the college operated on a complaint-based system. If no one filed a formal complaint, they didn't investigate. The 1995 report was just information, not a complaint, so it sat in a file. The 2014 report was just information, not a complaint, so it sat in another file. But here's the problem. Future employees couldn't see those files. When Crescent Care checked Wettlaufer's record before hiring her, all they saw was a clean license. They had no way of knowing about the 1995 termination because the college didn't make that information public. They had no way of knowing about the medication errors because the college hadn't investigated them. Commissioner Gillese's report was scathing on this point. She wrote that the college's system was so broken that, quote, nothing would have triggered an investigation into Wettlaufer or the underlying the offenses, end quote. Crescent Care had even more direct knowledge of Wettlaufer's problems. They suspended her 4 times for medication errors. They found her passed out in the basement during a night shift. They knew she was struggling. And when they finally fired her in 2014, they did something unforgivable. They gave her a glowing letter of recommendation. The letter described Wettlaufer as a good worker who loved to mentor and teach. It said she was leaving for personal reasons. It did not mention the suspensions. It did not mention the medication errors. It did not mention the concerns that led to her termination. Why would they do this? The inquiry found that Crescent Care was trying to avoid a grievance from the nurses' union. By giving Wettlaufer a positive reference and a $2,000 severance, they hoped she would go quietly and not fight her termination. They prioritized labor peace over public safety. The result? Wettlaufer walked into Meadow Park with a pristine recommendation and killed again within months. Remembering Maureen Pickering's family, who requested an autopsy and were told no death in a nursing home is unexpected. That wasn't just one coroner's bad judgment. It was a systemic bias against the elderly. The inquiry found that coroners across Ontario routinely declined to investigate deaths in long-term care, assuming they were natural. There was no protocol for investigating suspicious deaths in nursing homes. There was no requirement for autopsies. There was no presumption that elderly lives were worth the same investigative effort as younger lives. This bias gave Wettlaufer her cover. She could kill openly because no one was looking. Even after Wettlaufer confessed to her pastor, her sponsor, her ex-partners, no one called the police. The pastor later said he didn't fully believe her. The sponsor thought she was lying. The ex-partners thought she was exaggerating. But here's the thing, even if they had called, what would have happened? Wettlaufer hadn't been caught in the act. There was no physical evidence linking her to the deaths. The bodies had been cremated or buried years ago. Without a confession, there is no case. The police weren't negligent in this case. They were never given a chance to investigate. But the inquiry raised uncomfortable questions about how police handle reports of serial killing. If someone walks into a station and says, "I think my friend is a serial killer," what do you do? How do you investigate something that seems impossible? By September 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was falling apart. Her life was in ruins. She had been fired from multiple jobs. Her relationships had failed. Her addiction was out of control. She was, by her own account, suicidal. She checked herself in to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, in Toronto, one of Canada's premier psychiatric hospitals. She told them she was struggling with addiction and depression. She did not initially tell them about the murders, but over the course of her treatment, the truth began to emerge. She started talking to her psychiatrist. She mentioned that she had done things, terrible things, that she couldn't live with. The psychiatrist listened, and when Wettlaufer finally wrote it all down, the hospital did what it was legally required to do. They contacted the police. On September 30th, 2016, Wettlaufer sat down and wrote a 4-page confession. It was handwritten, detailed, and damning. She named names, she gave dates, she described methods. She didn't minimize or excuse, she simply laid out what she had done. This document would become the cornerstone of the case against her. Without it, there was nothing. With it, there was everything. When police arrived at CAMH, Wettlaufer was ready to talk. She agreed to a videotaped interview that would last more than 2 hours. Watching that video is a chilling experience. Wettlaufer is calm, composed, almost matter of fact. She describes the killings in clinical detail, the injections, the deaths, the aftermath. She shows no emotion when discussing the victims. The only time her voice wavers is when she talks about her own feelings, her own struggles. She describes the red surge. She describes the euphoria after killing. She describes the guilt that followed, the guilt that drove her to confess to anyone who would listen. And she describes the relief of finally being caught, of finally having it stop. At one point, the detective asks her why she did it. She pauses, then says, quote, "I don't know. I wish I did. I wish I could give you a reason that makes sense, but I don't have one." End quote. On June 1st, 2017, Elizabeth Wettlaufer stood in a courtroom in London, Ontario, and pleaded guilty to all charges: 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. The plea meant there would be no trial. No witnesses would have to testify. No families would have to relive their loved ones' deaths in open court. It was, in some small way, an act of mercy, or at least an avoidance of further cruelty. Over the following weeks, the court heard victim impact statements from the families. These statements, read aloud in a packed courtroom, were devastating. Sandy Millard describing her mother crying out for an hour. The Tucks describing their guilt over placing Maureen Pickering at quiescent care. Arpad Horvath Jr. calling his father his best friend and hero. Helen Young's niece describing the moment she hugged her aunt's murderer. One by one, they stood up and told the court what Wettlaufer had taken from them. Not just their loved ones, but their peace of mind, their sense of safety, their ability to trust. The ripple effects of Wettlaufer's crimes will continue for generations. On June 26, 2017, Justice Bruce Thomas delivered the sentence: life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Under Canadian law, this was the harshest sentence available. In his remarks, Justice Thomas looked directly at the families and delivered a line that captured the betrayal they felt. He said of Wettlaufer, quote, "She was far from the angel of mercy, more the shadow of death who passed over them." End quote. Wettlaufer showed no emotion as the sentence was read. She was led away in handcuffs, her face blank, her eyes empty. She was 50 years old. If she survives, she will be eligible for parole in 2042 at the age of 75. The Wettlaufer case was so shocking, so unprecedented, that the Ontario government launched a public inquiry to figure out how it could have happened. The inquiry, led by Commissioner Eileen Gillies, the inquiry spent 2 years examining every aspect of the case. The final report, released in 2019, was 1,200 pages long and contained 91 recommendations. Its central finding was devastating. Quote, "The evidence in this inquiry shows that nothing would have triggered an investigation into Wettlaufer or the incidents underlying the offenses." End quote. Nothing. Not the 1995 drug theft, not the 4 suspensions, not the medication errors, not the suspicious deaths. Nothing. Commissioner Gillies wrote that the system was so broken that it would not have discovered Wettlaufer's crimes if she had not confessed. The only reason we know her name is because she told us. The inquiry's recommendations covered every aspect of the system. Better tracking of nurses' employment histories, so problems at one job follow them to the next. Mandatory reporting of medication errors and suspicious incidents. An end to glowing reference letters for problematic employees. Required autopsies for unexpected deaths in long-term care, a central database of complaints and disciplinary actions, training for police and coroners on investigating deaths in care facilities. Some of these recommendations have been implemented, others are still pending. The question is whether they would actually catch the next Elizabeth Wettlaufer, or they're just paperwork solutions to a human problem. Commissioner Gillies ended her report with a warning that haunts everyone who reads it. Quote, "The fact that Wettlaufer is behind bars does not mean that we are safe from healthcare serial killers. It means only that we are safe from her." End quote. There could be others. There probably are others. People who have found ways to exploit the gaps in the system, to hide their crimes behind the assumption that old people just die. We don't know their names. We don't know how many victims they've claimed. All we know is that the system that failed to catch Wettlaufer is still largely the same system that exists today. As we near the end of this episode, I want to sit with the questions that remained unanswered. We have Wettlaufer's descriptions, the red surge, the euphoria, the feeling of being a vessel for God or the devil. But these are descriptions, not explanations. They tell us what it felt like, not why it happened. Some experts point to her borderline personality disorder, her narcissism, her addiction. Others point to her troubled childhood, her failed marriage, her professional frustrations. But none of these fully explain why she started killing, why she kept killing, why she stopped only when she was caught. The truth is, we may never know. And that uncertainty is part of what makes this case so disturbing. If we can't explain why Wettlaufer did it, we can't predict who might do it next. Wettlaufer confessed to 8 murders and 6 attacks, but investigators have always suspected there could be more. The time frame is long, nearly a decade. The opportunities were many, and Wettlaufer's memory, clouded by years of addiction and denial, may not be reliable. Some families have requested that their loved ones' bodies be exhumed for testing. In some cases, it's too late. The bodies were cremated. In others, the cost and trauma of exhumation are too great. We may never know the full scope of Wettlaufer's crimes. This is the question that keeps policymakers awake at night. The inquiry made 91 recommendations, but recommendations are not laws. Implementation is slow, uneven, and subject to budget constraints. The fundamental problem that we assume elderly deaths are natural, that we trust nurses unconditionally, that we don't investigate until it's too late, remains largely unchanged. The next Wettlaufer could be working right now in a nursing home near you, and we wouldn't know until she confessed. Elizabeth Wettlaufer is in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2042 when she is 75 years old. It is possible that she will die behind bars. It is also possible that she will one day walk free. But even if she never leaves prison, the shadow she cast remains. It remains in the families who can't sleep, who can't trust, who can't stop asking, what if? It remains in the nursing homes where staff now look at each other with suspicion. It remains in a system that failed so completely that a serial killer could operate for a decade without anyone noticing. The last word should go to the families, not to Wettlaufer, not to the experts, not to the officials, to the people who loved the people she killed, to Sandy Millard, who will always hear her mother crying out for help, to Arpad Horvath Jr., who lost his best friend and his hero, to the Tucks, who live with the guilt of placing their friend in harm's way, to John Matheson, who has been hospitalized 6 times by grief, to all of them, and to the 8 people who cannot speak for themselves: James Silcox, Maurice Granat, Gladys Millard, Helen Matheson, Mary Zurowinski, Helen Young, Maureen Pickering, Arpad Horvath. They were not just victims, they were people. They had lives before Elizabeth Wettlaufer entered their rooms. They had families who loved them. They had stories that deserved to end in peace, not in terror. Elizabeth Wettlaufer is the shadow of death, but they were the light, and that light, at least, cannot be extinguished. In the next episode, I will be talking about Robert Picton, who is a quiet, unassuming pig farmer who hid in plain sight while throwing raucous parties at his piggy palace and cruising the streets of Vancouver's downtown east side. He was committing the worst serial killings in Canadian history. Thank you for listening. As always, please take care of yourself after listening to this episode. Do something grounding, call a friend, pet a dog, sit in the sunlight for a few minutes. The darkness in these stories is real, but so is the light in the world. Don't forget to find it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Please follow me on Substack, Instagram, Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube. The links are in the show notes. Stay tuned for more coffee and more crime. Bye now.